1800s London industrial boom. Shocking changes. Next. My name doesn't matter. What matters is the city I watched change with my own eyes. I was born in London at the turn of the 1800s, in a house with no running water, no gas lighting, and no idea that the next 100 years would turn this city into the beating heart of the entire world. Stay with me, because what happened to London in this century didn't just change Britain. It changed how every city on earth would come to look. When I was a boy, London smelled like horses, coal smoke, and the river. The streets were narrow and cobbled, lit at night by oil lamps that barely held back the dark. Most people lived the way their grandparents had lived. Bread was baked at home or bought from a baker down the street. Cloth was spun by hand in cottages outside the city. Nobody owned a machine. Nobody needed one. A journey of even 20 miles took the better part of a day by horse and cart, so most people never traveled far from the street they were born on. News from the rest of the country could take days to arrive. The world I was born into still moved at the same pace it had moved at for centuries. Then, in the space of one lifetime, everything changed. It started quietly. Steam engines, first built to pump water out of coal mines, were adapted to drive machinery. Factories began rising along the rivers and canals outside London, and soon inside the city itself. The first time I saw a steam-powered mill running at full speed, the noise alone was enough to make my ears ring for an hour. Iron wheels, leather belts, the hiss of pressure-escaping valves. It was nothing like the quiet workshops I grew up around. By the 1820s and 1830s, London was no longer a city of craftsmen working alone. It was becoming a city of workers, all reporting to the same building, all working the same hours, all answering to a factory bell instead of the sun. A man who once had decided his own pace of work now stood at a machine that decided it for him. The machine didn't tire, didn't rest, and didn't care how he felt that morning. Entire trades that had taken years to learn by hand, weaving, spinning, even metalwork, could now be done faster by a machine operated by someone with only a few weeks of training. Skilled men, who once commanded respect for their craft, found themselves replaced by a device and a boy who could be paid a fraction of the wage. The factories needed two things above everything else: coal and people. Coal came in by barge and later by rail, dug from the ground in the north of England by men who rarely saw daylight. Entire towns grew up around coal pits, built for nothing else but feeding London's hunger for fuel. People came from the countryside in numbers nobody could have predicted. Farms that had supported families for generations could no longer compete with cheap, mass-produced goods. So families packed what they owned and walked to London, hoping the factories would pay better than the fields ever had. They were right, in a way. Wages in the city were often higher than what a farm laborer could earn in a season. But they had no idea what they were walking into. Nobody had told them about the rent on a single room, or the cost of coal to heat it, or how quickly a factory wage disappeared once the city had taken its share. 445, London's population exploded. At the start of the century, around 1 million people lived here. By the time Queen Victoria's reign was in full swing, that number had multiplied several times over, making London the largest city the world had seen since ancient times. The city simply wasn't built for that many people. Landlords carved single houses into a dozen cramped rooms. Entire families lived in spaces barely large enough for one bed. Streets that once held a handful of homes now held tenements stacked 3 and 4 stories high, with no sewage system to match the new crowds. I remember the smell of those streets. Coal smoke above, sewage below, and the constant sound of carts, hammers, and human voices everywhere in between. There was no such thing as quiet in those neighborhoods, not even at night. Someone was always working, always arguing, always trying to sell something by lamplight. 15. Disease moved through these neighborhoods the way fire moves through dry wood. Cholera outbreaks tore through London more than once in this century, killing thousands in a matter of weeks. Doctors at the time didn't even agree on how the disease spread. Many believed it traveled through bad air, rising from filth in the streets. It took years, and a now famous investigation tracing an outbreak back to a single contaminated water pump. Before the city understood that clean water wasn't a luxury, it was survival. That single discovery eventually led to one of the most important engineering projects London ever built. A proper sewer system running for over 1,000 miles beneath the city, finally separating waste from drinking water. The project took over a decade to complete and employed thousands of laborers digging through clay and rock beneath streets that never stopped moving above them. It's strange to think that something as unglamorous as a sewer pipe might have saved more lives than any single invention of the era. But while the poor crowded into slums, a very different London was rising just a few streets away. The factory owners, the merchants, the bankers who financed the railways and the mills, they built a London of wide avenues, gaslit street lamps, and grand town houses with servants behind every door. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side of a single street, children worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day in textile mills, their small hands useful for threading machines that adults couldn't reach into. On the other side of that same city, families dined on imported tea, wore silk brought by ship from the other side of the world, and worried about nothing more pressing than fashion. I worked for a time in one of those mills as a boy, before laws eventually limited child labor. The room was loud from the moment the doors opened until the moment they shut, and the air was thick with dust from raw cotton that settled in your throat by the end of the day. I won't pretend the work was anything but exhausting and dangerous. Machines didn't slow down for tired hands, and more than one boy I knew lost fingers to a piece of equipment that never stopped to notice he was there. 9:45, and yet, alongside all this hardship, London was becoming the most important city on the planet. The railways changed everything first. Steam locomotives connected London to every major city in Britain within just a few decades, returning journeys that once took days into trips of a few hours. A trip that had taken my grandfather 2 full days by coach could now be done before lunch. Goods, mail, and people moved faster before mine had ever experienced. Then came the Underground Railway, the first of its kind anywhere in the world, carrying Londoners beneath their own streets to escape the chaos above. I remember the strange feeling of riding in a carriage lit by gas lamps, deep below the same roads I had walked my entire life, and realizing that the city now existed in layers, one on top of another. The Thames itself became one of the busiest waterways on Earth. Ships from India, from the Caribbean, from China and the Americas, all docked along London's riverbanks, unloading goods that financed half the city's new wealth. Cotton from across the ocean fed the mills. Tea, sugar, and spices filled warehouses the size of cathedrals. And the docks themselves grew so large that entire neighborhoods were built just to house the men who worked them. 1130 London became the center of an empire that, by the later decades of this century, touched every continent. Decisions made in offices. A short walk from where I lived determined trade, law, and government for territories thousands of miles away. The city that smelled of coal smoke and sewage was, at the very same time, the financial and political capital of the largest empire the world had ever seen. I remember standing near the Thames the year the Great Exhibition opened, inside a building made almost entirely of glass and iron, something nobody had ever built at that scale before. It rose out of a park like something from another world, sunlight pouring straight through walls that weren't supposed to exist on a building that size. Inside were machines, inventions, and goods from every corner of the empire and beyond. Printing presses, steam hammers, raw materials, and finished silk side by side under one glass roof. 6 million people walked through those doors in just a few, more than half the population of the entire country at the time. It felt for a moment like the whole world had folded itself into one glass building in the middle of my city. But progress in London never came without a price, and that price was almost always paid by the people who had the least. Workers began to organize, slowly and against fierce resistance, into early unions, demanding shorter hours, safer conditions, and fair pay. It was not a popular cause among the men who owned the factories. Strikes were broken, organizers were dismissed, and for a long time the law sided firmly with the employer over the worker. But the pressure never stopped building. Reformers pushed laws through Parliament, limiting child labor, improving factory safety, and eventually expanding who was even allowed to vote. None of it came easily. Every improvement in this century was fought for, argued over, and resisted by people who profited from things staying exactly as they were. By the time I was an old man, the London of my childhood barely existed anymore. Gas lamps had given way to electric light in the busiest streets. Horse-drawn carts shared the road with steam vehicles. The population had grown beyond anything my grandparents could have imagined. And the skyline itself, smokestacks, church spires, and factory chimneys side by side, told the story of everything this century had built. 15, looking back now, I think the strangest part of living through it all was how normal it felt while it was happening. Nobody woke up one morning and decided London would become the center of global trade and industry. It happened in small steps. A new machine here, a new railway line there, a new law, a new outbreak, a new building rising, where an old field used to be. But step by step, this city became something the world had never seen before. The first truly industrial metropolis, built on coal, steam, ambition, and the labor of millions of people whose names were never written down anywhere. The London you know today, its underground trains, its riverside walks, even its old brick warehouses now turned into flats and galleries. All of it carries the fingerprints of this century. Every time you walk past an old factory building or cross a bridge over the Thames, you're walking through the same transformation I watched happen with my own eyes. That's the story of London in the 1800s. Not a single shocking moment, but 100 years of small changes that added up to one of the biggest transformations any city has ever gone through. If you want to see what happened next, when the 1900s arrived and changed London all over again, let me know in the comments, and I'll take you there next.